In this section, we're going to take a close look at the important topic of iOS application architecture. First off, we're going to learn about the Model View Controller design pattern, how Apple has implemented this MVC pattern in iOS, and we'll learn about the problems this architecture produces. Then we'll see how you can easily improve on it so your iOS apps are easier to create, maintain, and extend. The Model View Controller design pattern breaks your app into three main parts: Model, View, and Controller. The model is your app's data, and that usually translates into business entities, as we'll learn in our section on core data. So for example, if you were building an order processing app, your model might contain a customer entity, order entity, and product entity. The view is the part of the app the user interacts with directly and contains user interface objects such as text fields, buttons, sliders, and so on. The controller acts as an intermediary between the view and the model. The user interacts with the view. The view passes the call to the view controller in response to user input. The view controller updates the model. In turn, the model can fire events, and the view controller responds to those events and updates the view, and so on. The main reason you use the MVC pattern is for division of responsibilities. It also makes your code more reusable and your app far easier to maintain. Apple has its own unique interpretation of Model View Controller, and unfortunately the default iOS implementation of MVC actually prohibits reusability and maintainability rather than promoting it. Let's dive in and find out why. We're going to take a look at a very simple iOS app I have created that demonstrates Apple's implementation of MVC. It's very basic. If a user touches the Democrat button at the bottom left of the window, it displays the Democratic candidate for president in our last US election. If the user touches the Republican button, it displays the Republican candidate. If we go over to Xcode, you can see this app. Let's identify the model, view, and controller in this simple app. First, let's look at the model. There are a number of basic principles we haven't covered yet in this training, such as the use of core data, which we will get into later on. But for now, just know that I have created a data model in my project. This model contains a single business entity called candidate entity. As I mentioned in the MVC pattern, the model represents the app's data and usually takes the form of an entity object. In this example, the candidate entity has a number of properties: first name, home state, last name, party, and so on. Apple has this part of the pattern right. The model is not concerned with presentation. You can take this candidate entity and display it in any user interface. You could have one view of the candidate entity that's displayed on the iPad, another view to display on the iPhone. You may also have multiple iOS apps that use the same candidate entity, each with their own user interface. Now let's move on to the view. As you can see, we have a nib file with an XIB extension. If you click on the nib file, you can see it contains a reference to the view. The view is the place where you design your user interface. As you can see, I've already added user interface objects, 3 labels and 3 text fields, which are used to display candidate entities. Again, Apple has this part of the pattern right. I can create any number of different views which can be used to display the same candidate entities, either in this app or even in multiple iOS apps. I can create any number of different views which can be used to display the same candidate entities. Now let's look at the controller. If I click on the Assistant Editor button, it displays the code file associated with the view, which in this case is the view controller. Now this is where Apple's implementation of MVC gets a little shaky. Apple has set up an architecture where all the code associated with the view and the model gets stored in the associated view controller. Typically, you need to reference user interface objects found on the view from within the code in your view controller. However, you can't do this by default. To make it so you can reference a UI object, you have to create an outlet, which is basically a property, on the view controller, and then wire up a connection to the UI object in the view. For example, to do this, I can select an object in the view, in this case our first name text field. If I hold the control key down, I click here and drag down below. Notice the pop-up says Insert Outlet Action or Outlet Collection. If I let go of my mouse, I get a little dialog that pops up, and I'm going to create an outlet from which I can reference this text field. I'm going to call that outlet something descriptive. I'll use txt as a prefix to indicate that it is a text field, and I'll say first name. And I click Connect. So you can see that it has created a property and associated variable behind the scenes. Let's go ahead and do the same for the other two text fields. I control click, I drag down below. When I let go, I can now say txt last name and click Connect. And we'll do one more. I'll select home state, I'll control and click down below. When I let go, I can specify txt home state, and then I click Connect. As you can see, the view controller is tightly bound to the view. It has properties that refer to user interface objects on the view. This makes the view controller difficult to reuse elsewhere in your app, because in order to function properly, any view associated with this view controller must have the same user interface objects. Now let's take it to the next step. We want the app to perform an action when the user clicks either the Democrat or the Republican button. To make this happen, you need to create an action method into which you can place code to be executed for each button. To do this, select the button in the design surface, go to the Connections Inspector, and then drag from the Touch-Up Inside event into the View Controller code file. So we are selected to insert an action, and we'll call this one Get Democrat, and click Connect. Now we'll select the Republican button, and again, click on Touch Up Inside, drag down into the view controller, and we'll call this action Get Republican, and we'll click Connect. In Objective-C, classes are comprised of two source code files, a .h file, such as the one that we've been working with here, that contains the public interface of the class, and a .m file that contains the implementation code. Now that we've set up the public interface, let's switch to the .m file. And I'll come over here and change my editor so that we can see the file in all of its glory. If I scroll down below, you'll see that we have two new methods into which we can place code: Get Democrat and Get Republican. Now I'm going to put some code in each method that retrieves the appropriate Democrat or Republican entity, or model object. In the Get Democrat and Get Republican methods, I have placed calls to two other methods I have added to the view controller. The first method, Get Candidate by Party, retrieves the candidate entity for the specified party. You don't need to know everything that's happening in this method, although we will be covering this in great detail in our section on core data. But just know that this code creates a request for a candidate entity, executes that request, then returns the candidate that matches the search criteria. The second line of code in each method calls the bind entity method, which binds the candidate entity to the user interface objects. Let's see how this works at runtime. If I run the project, it launches the iOS simulator. Now, when I click the Democrat button, you can see it retrieves the Democratic candidate entity and binds it to the text fields. When I click the Republican button, it retrieves the Republican candidate entity and binds it to the text field. So what's the problem? Well, this code works fine if I only want to retrieve a candidate from this view. But what happens if I want to retrieve a candidate entity from another view in the app? Or what if I've created a suite of election apps and I want to reuse the code in a completely different app? I'm out of luck because the code that retrieves candidates is stuck in the view controller, which is strongly bound to the first view. So how can I make this code more reusable? Well, if you remove the getCandidateByParty method from the view controller and place it in a class of its own, a business controller, you can reuse the business controller and method from any view controller. So in a true model view controller design pattern, the controller is not a view controller, but a business controller. If we take a look at this method again in Xcode, this is truly both business and data logic, which you do not want in your user interface. Placing this code in the view controller, which is truly a user interface class, creates a monolithic app that is difficult to create, extend, and maintain. I have created another project in Xcode that uses the improved MVC architecture. I've created a new group called Business Objects, and in that group I have placed the Candidates entity, as well as a new business controller class simply called Candidate. Notice the getCandidateByParty method that we used to have in the view controller is now in the candidate business controller. If you look at the view controller code, notice it's much cleaner. It simply makes a call to the business controller to retrieve the appropriate entity and then binds it. The only code you want in your user interface is code that is specific to the user interface, as well as calls to your business controller to retrieve and update entities. Later on in this training, we'll dive further into business controllers and business entities to see how you can best use these powerful objects in your iOS apps.